It's a strange time because I guess normally come sort of July and certainly August, a lot of the galleries would historically be closed. It's kind of the summer period.
Right.
And yet, of course, obviously, we've had 3 or 4 months where the entire London art scene has come to a halt. So it's a bit of a strange time, I think, for the UK art market at the moment. Here in London, around the 15th of June, I think it was, the first galleries were able to reopen. So there's been some really positive signs there. And obviously auctions have now resumed. It's good in terms of sort of where we are with the kind of pandemic, I guess, followed quite a similar trajectory here in London. As New York, actually. The infection rates in London have been going down, but quite unusually, I think, compared to other countries across Europe. The pandemic seems to be UK-wide. So at the moment, the last 2 or 3 days, there have been more regional lockdowns in the northern regions around Yorkshire, Manchester. I think that's all our concern really at the moment, is how we proceed into the autumn with the possibility of these sort of regional lockdowns and how that then affects the kind of peaks and troughs of the business.
So how has that been like before the COVID, with the shadow of this Brexit idea, of course?
You're absolutely right, Henrietta, in terms of the London and UK art market. It's always been historically very, very strong. And I think we've really, since 2008, been generally on an upward trajectory, which has been great. I think the uncertainty, again, around Brexit, about what might transpire and what that might mean for the art market, has meant that there's been a certain degree of uncertainty about the stability of the London art market. So in fact, it was a conversation we had at last year's conference in September 2019. And it's been a topic that's been quite well written about and documented, is looking at other cities regionally, such as Paris, for example, and a number of key gallerists have opened up in Paris in the last year. So there has been some uncertainty, but generally the art market in London has been, or the UK has been, really, really strong. There have been conversations, and there were conversations certainly towards the end of last year. A lot of art market journalists were commentating and saying, can we sustain this? Is this possible? Is this momentum possible? And so I think even before we went into 2020, and even before we knew what we were facing potentially with this global pandemic, I think we were all asking ourselves questions about whether we could sustain the pace that we had all set ourselves in the art market. So as I went into planning ahead for my New York conference in March, some of those key questions in terms of planning my topics and subjects were coming to the fore at that stage. And one of them was in relation to the pace at which the art market was operating, specifically with things related to international travel, sustainability, the environment. So I was seeing in London a lot more meetings, conferences, discussions around sustainability and how the art world needed to tackle it. And there were specific organizations that had been set up to advise and guide on this. So that was one of the key questions we were going to ask in March, is sort of, how can we be more sustainable? And of course, since everything has happened and we've all had to slow down and pretty much stay where we are, the question of sustainability, I think, has continued, actually. I appreciate that for so many, this isn't a primary concern. The primary concern really is to try and restart your business. I think statistically, if you look at the various art market reports that exist, yes, the percentage share of the Parisian or French art market is still relatively low in comparison to London. I think the questions and the challenges as we face towards the end of this year with Brexit is the uncertainty over import and export and how that might affect the strength and positioning of the art market. If people want to still buy and sell in London, and that it has competitive advantages, potentially in terms of taxation and so forth. So there's very much the sort of the business element to doing business in London, that we obviously need to make sure that London continues to be strong and appealing, I guess, from the point of view of buying and selling. We're very lucky here in the UK. We have an organisation called the British Art Market Federation, and Anthony Brown is the head of that. It's a great organisation in the sense that it brings together all the various trade associations for the galleries, but also all the leading auction houses. Anthony really represents the British Art Market Federation as such, but he spends and devotes a lot of his time working very closely with DCMS and working with the government to make sure that the art market voice is heard, which I think now more than ever is absolutely critical. So, for example, there was a discussion, I believe, earlier in the spring about the reopening process for galleries and museums. And I think originally that commercial galleries were included as part of the museums opening, which was I think the very last round of reopening. And I think DCMS were lobbied quite hard on this in terms of actually arguing that galleries are essentially non-essential retail. So I think by the 15th of June, they were able to open that little bit earlier, which I think was a real boost for the art trade.
How do you see the UK market will continue? And in terms of the gallery scene now in more in London, also how would it evolve given the lingering effect of the pandemic?
I think that's the problem at the moment, isn't it? It's almost for every single business. You could almost pretty much rip up your business plan for 2020. This is the concern, that I think planning at the moment almost has to be month by month, which obviously can be deeply problematic. But I think the uncertainty is really difficult to deal with. The fact that there may be regional lockdowns during the autumn, or we may go back into full lockdown again. That's quite difficult, I think, to deal with. But having seen what the galleries have done since the 15th of June here in London, I think everybody's taken that opportunity and that momentum. And I think those visiting the galleries have taken that opportunity and that momentum. And so I think what we're moving to very much is galleries and art businesses living in the moment. If you can get the exhibition open and have people come in, and I think that the galleries that have reopened have seen really great positive footfall. Obviously, they've had to be mindful of all the different new legislation that they need to in order to open, and obviously ticketed and timed slots to come and visit the galleries. But actually, the momentum's really been there. And so I think what we'll see probably for the autumn is more of a pop-up style culture. My business very much found itself at the forefront. March obviously was a very interesting month because we were due to host the New York conference.
That's right.
And then sort of since then found my business very much in stasis. But the reason I really created the conference in the first place, and it really goes back to what we were discussing initially about that huge sort of talent pool and actually seeing the professionalization of the global art world. There's so many more people coming to work in the industry. And so the real focus and goal of the conference was really to talk about the operational side of the business, kind of what is sort of behind the scenes of the art business in terms of the dynamics of buying and selling art. And so a lot of that relates to things like art law, logistics, insurance, conservation. Obviously, since we're no longer able to meet in person, I would like to launch a series of online talks, more Zoom, but hopefully to sort of unite that global community. Because obviously we had conferences in London, New York, and Shanghai, and so it'd be great to try and unite those those communities together. And of course, so many of those those kind of key topics haven't really gone away. And as I said to you earlier, I was really interested to read that the questions over the continuation of the momentum on sustainability, looking at digital tools and digital platforms that the art business are now using and adopting, and some of those really challenging issues around import, export. To add to all the momentum around Brexit as well, we have the new anti-money laundering regulations that are coming in here in the UK as well. So it's really, I suppose, about a sort of professional, a continuing professional development program for the art market. So we can all congregate and talk through these things.
Can you tell us a little bit about like your idea of the app?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Henrietta. Yeah, I think what I'm very conscious of, and obviously we will be doing online talks, and obviously they are at a specific time on a specific day. But I'm also very conscious of how everybody's timetable has shifted. Our daily routines have shifted, particularly if you have families and you're managing a business with homeschool. And so I think it's quite hard to keep that momentum that perhaps we have with the conference, or that you have with an art fair, where it's one time, one place, and we all have to gather.
True.
And so I've been trying to think through the dynamics of that and how to harness and utilize technology so that we can all still interact, all still have these really important collective conversations, but not necessarily have to congregate in one place and one time. So at the moment we're trialing an app where we can all meet as interactive groups, to have discussion boards, and to share information, knowledge and insight collectively as a global art market. But they will hopefully be groups that you can kind of dip in and out of with your particular interest group, whether it's kind of logistics or insurance or art law. And hopefully we can collectively share information amongst ourselves. I think also what we've seen, which has been very interesting, is quite a lot more experimentation from art businesses in terms of thinking about not just digital tools, but actually content. I guess if you say content is king, really.
Yeah.
And just looking at all those different platforms that you can use and how you can use them. So I know, for example, studio visits on Instagram have proved really, really successful. Yeah, there's a lot out there and a lot to navigate, but content creation and good content creation is, I think, really, really, really valuable to the gallery scene right now. And in fact, all art businesses. And what's quite interesting from having had various conversations, obviously, the whole of the art business was very much event driven. It was very much about, the number of auctions, the number of art fairs. And I think what we're thinking about now in terms of sort of content and content output for galleries is perhaps a more deeper focus, but actually what we perhaps refer now to as evergreen content, where there's a deeper engagement with the artist practice. And by virtue of that, hopefully a greater return to connoisseurship. It's quite interesting. We did a webinar collaboration with Artsy a few weeks ago, and Joe Stella, who is the senior director at Goodman Gallery, raised a really interesting point. They did a studio visit live on Instagram with William Kentridge. What was really interesting about that is, she said, usually we'd have a patrons group, we'd all, be flying to South Africa, and so it's a long journey to be able to access that, which is great. But suddenly, William is able to broadcast and reach a massive global audience, and people were able to ask him questions directly. And so there's a whole way of engagement that digital tools can engage that global art community. And it goes back so much to what we talked about earlier about where we're seeing political change, that I hope the art world will buck that trend. And digital tools are a way to keep us all connected while we can't be sort of physically together.